So back in 2014, some of you are familiar with our family's story. My wife Beth and I, our kids, and 2014, we, along with about 30 other missionaries serving in a different country, had to leave the country pretty unexpectedly. And so there were a lot of ramifications of that for a lot of people. One of the very minor ones being we had been dressing like it was 1999 back in America for a long time. And so if you ever have a missionary visiting, just be gracious to them when they're wearing, I don't know, like really baggy pants or something like that. Birkenstocks, I think those are back in right now. But so one of my closest friends, he was actually out of the country visiting the States when we found out we were leaving. And so he actually asked some of us to go and pack up his apartment. And one of our very close mutual friends, her name is Jess, she was going through his wardrobe. And out of a great love for my friend, she was like, "Hey, Gunnar, I'm not going to send back these massive green cargo shorts for you to wear because that is not okay anymore. Like, the times have changed. You did not change with them, and I know what is good for you and what is appropriate, and so out of love for you, you get to keep like 2 articles of clothing that are in your wardrobe right now, and when you move to Los Angeles, find a new friend and have them take you to the store because you're not taking back these things that are so clearly out of date, so clearly not with it, and are not okay any longer. So please also have some compassion on me. I think I still have some stuff from like 2 decades ago that I still wear. But when you heard this passage read, I'm assuming that it struck you as weird, maybe super outdated, maybe completely not applicable to where we are today. But when you remember the context this is originally written in, when you remember who this was written to, that original audience, you're going to see that this case law, right, this extrapolation of the 10 Commandments in what is known as the Book of the Covenant, from chapters 21 to chapter 23 in Exodus, what we're really going to see is, man, this is God being incredibly gracious to a people way back then, and it's actually God being incredibly gracious to us today. Because the culture that we find ourselves in today, just like at any other point, in any other place in time, history and culture presents you with a list of moral norms, right? Here's a list of moral norms, and these vary, right, from country to country, from decade to decade at times. But wherever you find yourself today, the culture at large expects everyone to adhere and believe a certain set of moral norms regarding things like power and honor, or things like abortion and sex and gender. But at the same time, what our culture also prizes most is you be you, right? You determine who you are, you decide what to be, and go be it. But these 2 directives are just diametrically opposed to one another. Right, on one hand, here's the list of norms, right? You've got to uphold these list of moral norms. And on the other hand, you're only truly free through self-discovery, right? You have to determine what is right because of the importance that we also place on individualism in our culture today. And these 2 paradigms, they're just impossible to hold together. Because what if you being true to yourself sets you on a different side than what pop culture tells you is right? There's also the small problem that we change our minds from time to time. Like my friend Gunnar doesn't wear cargo shorts from the 90s anymore. But how can we trust ourselves to divide and then to decipher what is good and what actually leads to life and flourishing? Last week, Richard preached an incredible sermon on the 10 Commandments. And so if you haven't heard that, if you're unfamiliar with the 10 Commandments, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that. But God opens the 10 Commandments with this statement. He says, "I am the Lord. I am Yahweh." And he immediately backs it up by reminding the Israelites, "I am the God who brought you out of slavery, who defied all the odds and delivered you from a mighty oppressor in Pharaoh in Egypt and just put to shame their puny gods." I just recently watched the movie Avengers with my kids for the first time. If you've seen this, at the very end, Hulk goes up to Loki, and Loki's like, "How could you? Don't approach me. Don't threaten me. I am a god." And if you've seen this, Hulk just takes Loki and smashes him around like he was a rag doll, Stella's laughing right now, and kind of jokingly laughs to himself, puny God, when he leaves Loki in the dust. And this is literally what God has done to an entire Egyptian army. To Pharaoh in all his might, all his power, he has shown him to be just puny, just absolutely nothing compared to Yahweh. And the result of God's saving work and deliverance, when Moses retells this story to his father-in-law Jethro, is what we see in chapter 18, verse 11, is Jethro's confession, "Oh, now I know that the Lord is greater than all the other puny, imaginary, false gods." But what we see in the Ten Commandments and here in the book of the Covenant is one true God making absolute claims on his creation. He's claiming absolute authority over his people and how he's made them. In a sense, he's saying, hey, I wrote the owner's manual. Like, I know how this works, and I know what real freedom and I know what real flourishing looks like. And then when God comes in the flesh, is Jesus, he makes the same claim when he says in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Right? The only way you will find what is true, the only way that you will even have the ability to know what is true and what is good and what is lasting, Jesus unabashedly says, I am that only way. And so, does that absoluteness sound oppressive or liberating? It may sound oppressive to you. In fact, it probably does sound oppressive to you if up until this point in life you felt like, hey, I'm kind of doing okay on my own, and I don't really feel my need for God. But imagine for a second what it might have sounded like to the Israelites who first heard this, and all that they have known their entire lives is slavery. That has been their identity. They were born into that. And for them to, with that background, to then hear these words in Exodus chapter 21, if you serve a master for 6 years, on the seventh you go free for nothing, just absolutely free. Or if you are serving a master and he abuses you, then you go free. Verse 21, you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or any fatherless child. Right? These rules, I would imagine, sounded incredibly comforting to the Israelites. They probably sounded too good to be true. And far from feeling restrictive or like a loss of their freedom, these rules meant protection like they had never enjoyed before. It meant belonging, and it meant life. Right? And we too, like the newly freed people of Israel, like my friend Gunnar, who'd been partying like it was 1999 for 2 decades in big green cargo shorts, we too desperately need to know what is right and what is good and what is pleasing and what is acceptable. Right? Not so that we can just kind of fit in with pop culture or be able to signal to other people, hey, we know what is right. No, we need to know how to live in such a way that we are in a right relationship with a God who made us and loves us and knows what is good for us. Right, we need to know what his standards of good and bad are, like what he thinks is of lasting worth and praise. We need to know what it takes to be truly free and to have the life and have it abundantly. And so what I hope we'll see this morning as we look at this passage is that it is only by becoming servants of God that we become truly free. And so let's start with the first commandment that God expands upon here in chapters 21 through 23 when he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Therefore, commandment number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. All right, so if you have a God, you serve that God, and you serve that God alone. When God says, I'm all there is, I'm the creator, I'm the master, and what he reveals about himself, about what kind of master he is, it's in these verses that we are loved and protected and treasured by the best master that there could possibly be. He takes care of our needs. He doesn't treat us like those former masters in Egypt that were oppressive and cruel, and the only time they came near was with a whip to punish. But in John 15, verse 15, Jesus says about himself, no longer do I call you slaves, for For the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. Right? God's heart has always been for the oppressed and for the sojourner. It's always been to uplift women and to look out for children. His heart has always been for the vulnerable and those who feel weighed down, to know that their God is a God of refuge. But when we hear words like submission, right, or the idea even of becoming God's servant as a way to really, truly find freedom, that's hard for us to hear, isn't it? Because the air we breathe and the waters that we swim in say that you and only you have the power to determine and decide what is right. Right? Only you have the power to determine what is true and what is ultimate. And I would just submit that that is a crushing burden to carry. Because how can we be sure that we can be sure of what is good? How can we be sure that we can know what is true? And then how can we actually live up to those standards that we place? Starting, I think it was maybe 2005, and for about a decade, the TV show The Office was one of the most popular shows in the country. I think as recently as 2018, something like 52 billion minutes of The Office was streamed on Netflix. I think we streamed at least like a whole 8 seasons of that as well. But in an interview, this was just a few years ago, one of the creators of the show said that networks would likely shy away from the series now. He said, quote, "It might be impossible to do that show today and have people accept it the way it was accepted 10 years ago. The climate's different." I mean, the whole idea of that character, Michael Scott, so much of it was predicated on inappropriate behavior, end quote. And I use this as an example, not to persuade you to watch or not watch The Office, but simply to show you how prone we are to change our minds about what is good, what is acceptable, both as individuals, but also collectively as a society. To swing pretty drastically from what we say, hey, this is totally acceptable, even hilarious, to being appalled, right, that we would ever condone such a thing as a society. And so I think we could look at this, we could say with a lot of confidence, societies 1,000 years ago, if they were viewing us today, they would find some of our practices, some of our norms, absolutely barbaric and appalling, right, as evolved as we have gotten. And I think that we could also be sure that cultures 1,000 years from now will look back at this time and this place and say, what in the world were they thinking? That is barbaric and that is appalling. Right, The Office won all kinds of awards. It was nominated for dozens more. And now, just a few years after the show ended, the climate is different. It might be impossible to do that show today and have people accept it the way it was accepted 10 years ago. Right? How do we know we can get it right on our own? When we go to ourselves, or any number of authorities for that matter, to determine, what should be praised? What can really be trusted with great assurance? The prophet Jeremiah writes in chapter 17 that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? And knowing this, because he created our hearts, this is what God does in his mercy for a group of people who have known nothing but slavery. They haven't governed themselves or created laws or traditions or regulations to try and help facilitate a society that would flourish and protect the weak. And so what does God do? He comes near and says, you are my treasured possession. You are a holy nation. Let me share my heart with you so that you can know for certain how to live, so that you can know for certain how it is you should treat one another. Let me show you the right set of restraints that lead to true freedom. Richard and I were talking about this metaphor. I think it was made popular by a pastor named Tim Keller. I don't know if he came up with it, but he talks about a fish. And so if a fish, most fish live in water, right? And so if a fish decides, you know what, this water is super restrictive. I want to be where the people are, right? I want to see them dancing, so I'm just going to leave the water, and I'm just going to throw off the water. I'm just going to go live on land. Is that fish free? No, that fish needed the water. The fish needed that restraint to actually flourish and to actually be free. And to throw off that restraint literally results in death for that fish. And so water being this life-giving regulation for fish, you will not have to wonder if these rules and regulations will be outdated in 10 years or 10,000 years. Because this is the heart of the one true God who himself is love, who himself is unchanging and eternal. But we don't have time to walk through these 3 chapters of this case law, but if you do happen to own an ox, and that ox is known to gore people, just keep reading for some really helpful instruction. But we're going to cover, hopefully, some of the big ones to see what it is that God is really getting at here. So number 1, starting in verse number 2, this is the command God leads with. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. And so first, God starts with addressing slaves because he's addressing slaves, these former slaves, people who have spent their entire life oppressed and threatened, abused, and worked to death. And this passage has wrongly been used by pro-slavers in the past to say, look, God clearly condones slavery. When in fact, this passage, especially if you read what immediately follows it, emphatically concludes that slavery, as we know it, especially here, is just absolutely contra God and contra God's heart and his design for humans. And so up until about even 50 years ago, every Bible translation that was out there translated this word slave as servant. Right? The idea being that this servant is under contract to work X number of years, and then after that contract is up, he can either re-up with that master or he can go free and do whatever he wants. But listen to what happens here, again, if a servant is mistreated by his master. Verse 12, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. This meant slaves as well, which would have been absolutely unthinkable to the Israelites reading this and hearing this for the first time. In Egypt, slaves were considered subhuman property to do with whatever they wanted to do with zero recourse. Keep reading verse 16. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. So that stealing and selling of men, women, and children is what our minds go to when we think of slavery. And God says, that deserves death. That is heinous. Every man, woman, and child is made in the image of God. And so verse 27, if anyone knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. And so again, I just have to imagine when Moses is reading this to the Israelites, they were probably looking from person to person in disbelief. Like, can you believe this? We are no longer slaves, but now we have protection. We have dignity in our work. We now have status as apprentices and teachers and physicians. We have value placed on our life by the God who sees us. And like most of the examples in these chapters, there's probably not a one-to-one correlation, again, for you today to apply in your life. But the principle that God wants us to see is that we are to treat people, regardless of status, gender, race, political leaning, right, you name it, with dignity, value, and worth. Because the God who created them created you and them with the exact same dignity, value, and worth in his image. He says to a group of sojourners and immigrants in chapter 22, verse 21, you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. And again in chapter 23, verse 9, you shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. And so it may be pretty easy, or maybe it's pretty difficult for you to see yourself this morning as a sojourner, like as someone on the outside looking in. But if you were a follower of Jesus this morning, you were once on the outside looking in. Like you were once desperate for life, and God performed a miracle to move you from death to life and to give you saving faith. Like you were once the most far away sojourner possible. And God, out of just pure grace, pure mercy, welcomes you into his household as no longer a slave or a servant, but as a friend. I think we just got to keep this fact in front of us, lest we start to look down on other people, and lest we forget that we need this gospel, this good news every day to sustain us, to have Jesus forgiving and sustaining and covering our brokenness. And remember that And we did not earn this. There was no list of rules that we kept that got us to a place where God now looks on us and says, well done, you're okay now. But it was a free gift. And so rather than thinking ourselves better or higher than anyone, we simply extend the love of God to them because we were once sojourners and outsiders that God dealt kindly with. How about verse 7? When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male servants do. And so again, the most vulnerable group of people in the ancient Near East, it was women and children. And so why would God permit a father to sell his daughter? And so far from this being a way for the father to profit and just to make money off his child, this was the father caring and looking out for and actually improving the prospects of his daughters, a way to lift her out of poverty and find a stable place where she could be provided for. The idea is actually closer to that of an arranged marriage, which again, I know in our culture today we have a lot of questions about, probably pretty skeptical about. But look again at the protections surrounding this arrangement. In verse 8, if the master decides he doesn't want her to marry his son, then she shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, or if he does allow his son to marry her, then verse 9, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. And if he fails to provide protection, food, clothing, then she shall go out free with payment of money, without payment of money. So again, what do we see about God's heart for the vulnerable here? It's, I'm going to lift them out of poverty. I'm going to hold back the oppressor. I'm going to give them a place where they are known and cared for and treasured. And so, how well are we as a society, or even we as a church, doing to value every human like God values them, like he desires and intends for them to be valued? Which political party values and fights for and protects every individual, regardless of race, economic status, or stage of life, with equal vigor? Which culture throughout the history of the world has always sought out and protected the vulnerable like this? If you think the biblical sexual ethic and the biblical view that marriage is between one man and one woman, if you find that restrictive or prudish or even oppressive, there is a reason that the biblical sexual ethic became the dominant sexual ethic in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Because no longer was it permissible for men of a higher social class to prey upon women and children of a lower social class with impunity. Right? No longer can women and children be taken advantage of and then just discarded to go and live in abject poverty. These principles that God lays out in the 10 Commandments and in the book of the Covenant are timeless because they are given by a God whose heart is timeless and who does not change. Right? But we do. Right? We do change. And so how do we live in light of not just these principles that God lays out, but how do we live in light of God's heart that we see here in these commands? If we're operating under the assumption that we really do have what it takes within us to decide for ourselves what is true, and if we actually think that we have the power and the ability to then uphold what we've determined to be true, it's only a matter of time before those expectations crush us. I don't need a show of hands because I know the answer, but did anyone else fail miserably as a parent or a friend, spouse this week? Anyone else murder someone in their heart with the thought this week, anyone who could vote like that on the recall is fill in the blank. Anyone, verse 17, curse his father or mother at some point and need to be put to death. Right? No matter how hard we try, no matter how outwardly good we get, these laws or any other law that you could go to or create for yourself or take from pop culture, it will never save you. Right? There is no law that will give you freedom. You will never get life because the law that we're reading this morning was not given in order to save us. Right? God knew we could never keep the 10 Commandments. He knew that they would be shattered literally by Moses and just a few chapters later by all of Israel. And so instead of giving us this syllabus or this kind of checklist to obtain our salvation, or even a religion to adhere to as best we can to earn our salvation, God instead gives us a person. Or we don't have an impersonal God who simply gives commands for us to be saved by and then says, good luck, and leaves us on our own. But we read in Philippians 2 that Jesus emptied himself by taking the form of a slave. That was his social status. It's the slave that Jesus chooses to identify as and with. Listen again to chapter 21, verse 5, and to see how Jesus not only identifies with the weak and the oppressed, but also how he saves them. Verse 5, but if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God. He shall bring him to the door of the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. All right, arguably the most important body part of any servant was the ear, because if they didn't hear their servant's will and their commands, then how in the world were they supposed to follow them and obey? And what we see is hours before Jesus went to the cross, he's in a garden and he's praying with his Father. And he's asking him, Father, if there is any other way for my people to be saved, let's go with that way. And yet he says, but not my will, but your will be done. And so Jesus loved his master. And rather than choosing to save himself and serve himself and go free, Jesus says, I'm going to stay. I'm not going to go out free, but I'm going to stay. And he submits to the will of his Father, and he was pierced for our transgressions. He, like a lowly slave, was pierced through, and his blood ran down the doorpost, just like the slave here in 21. All right, Jesus did not do this to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, so that he could offer true freedom if we would just receive him, receive the Savior who became a slave for our sake. Right, this salvation, this way, this truth, and this life, it is unchanging, it is eternal, and it is free. Right, Jesus gave his life for you to be able to accomplish this. So very practically, how can we apply this? Right, God tells us in chapter 23 of Exodus, verse 7, I will not acquit the wicked. And so when you find yourself in the midst of pain and suffering, and you're wondering, why? Like, why is this still happening? What we can look at and point to unequivocally is we can say, God sees. He sees your suffering. I will not acquit the wicked. So if you study the Bible, what we find is that your suffering is never wasted. Your suffering is also going to be redeemed. We looked at Revelation a few months ago, and we see that in the new heavens, the new earth, the new creation that God is working, he deals with it in a way that gives dignity to it and healing, complete newness. There is evil that persists today, and God sees that, and he moves towards it, and he says there will come a day when perfect justice will be applied. And so what this means practically for us is that we don't have to be saviors. This is what I kind of thought of this week for myself. I know I sometimes work and labor and act like I really can save. If I can just do the work, if I can just put in the hours, then there can be like salvation that happens. And the invitation here is not to go and be your own savior, not to go and work and find the ways to make yourself acceptable. The message here is that you're only acceptable because of Jesus and his submission, his work for your behalf. So what we get to simply do is just offer this to other people. We don't have to be the ones with all the answers. We get to simply extend the love of Christ to them. Very briefly, again, number 2, these laws can seem burdensome. If you just picked up the 10 Commandments, like Richard said, if you saw this on the back of your school wall when you were growing up, you can look at this and think, yeah, that's kind of crushing. Like I do all of these on a regular basis in some form or fashion. And so this week, when you inevitably sin and just blow it big, worship big. Don't sit in shame and self-hatred and loathing and figure out, hey, I'm going to make all these promises to God and kind of work my way back into his good graces. No, worship him because he's already forgiven you. And when you can freely go to him and ask for forgiveness, you know that he's not going to just throw a list of commandments at you. When Jesus receives people, that come to him in the New Testament, what we see is he's not like, okay, let's go to the 10 Commandments and this is how you get right. He says, no, my burden is easy and my yoke is light. And so that's the Jesus who is welcoming you to just come, not to work and earn your salvation, but to look at the cross and see that it is already done. It is accomplished. It is finished. And that's how we're accepted. We simply receive for the first time or again that Jesus' work is enough for you this morning. Let me thank him for that. Father, your word is good. Your word is life. Jesus, you are the only one that has the words of life, and there is nowhere else we can go. So, Father, would you enable us to come this morning, to set aside pride, to set aside the ways that we think we can work salvation on our own. And God, would you give us the grace and the faith that we need to receive you this morning? God, would you give us the power to do that? We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.